of experience in Washington politics and a deep and abiding interest in the role women have played in American history, Cokie Roberts has a singular perspective on the importance of women in shaping our country. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Cokie Roberts to the Boston Public Library.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here in this beautiful room, in this glorious library. I spent a good deal of time studying here when I was a student at Wellesley a day or two ago, there were guys here. They tended to be old guys, but still. And I'm thrilled to have an evening where I don't have to talk about Donald Trump. In fact, probably in the time since I've been standing here, 5 more candidates have announced. It is going to be quite a fun election year, but that's not the subject of the night. And I am honored, Bill Lowell, thank you for having me here with the Lowell Lecture. I saw the other lecturers, and I'm somewhat daunted to be in their company. I know the last one was Joseph Ellis, and of course he's got a wonderful new book out about the quartet, the 3 men who wrote the Federalist Papers plus George Washington. Of course, one of those men is Alexander Hamilton, and there's a lot of Sturm und Drang at the moment over Hamilton and the $10 bill, and he might be replaced by, oh no, a woman. And there's all this, upset. Oh my God, Alexander Hamilton was so great. I have to tell you, don't cry for Alexander Hamilton. First of all, he cheated on his wife, and then he left her destitute, and he did, and he wrote this ridiculous letter the night before he went out to fight that dumb duel, where he said, he couldn't even tell her about it because it would unman me, and think about that duel. It was the sitting vice president of the United States who murdered his political enemy over political speech. Our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but I don't think that was it. But Hamilton, his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, really saved his political career after he had to admit to having an affair and being bribed and blackmailed and all that. And he had written this big confession, and she kept buying them up because she hated the fact that it was out there, and so unscrupulous printers would print more and more of them, so she'd buy more and more of them. She really was just the first in a long line of political wives who have to stand, behind their husbands with that sick smile on their faces, when the man is admitting to some perfidy. And they're always wearing pearls. Have you noticed that? The women are always wearing pearls. I happen to like pearls, but they wear pearls in these circumstances. And I was talking about that one time when I was talking about Hamilton. And a woman sent me up a note and said, "Pearls behind swine." Well, I noticed that the subject of these lectures is the Revolutionary period from 1750 to 1780, and I have literally written a couple of volumes about that. So I wanted to isolate out something for tonight's lecture, and I am thrilled to discover, I just discovered when I was downstairs looking at this wonderful exhibition, that the period that I've isolated is the period of that exhibit. The difference is what I'm going to talk to you about, which you would not know if you went to that exhibit, sorry, is that there were women revolutionaries. And I want to talk to you about the significant part that the women of Boston played in fomenting the rebellion that led to independence. As you see it's a really quite good exhibition downstairs. That when the British started harshly taxing the colonies to pay for the protection that the British felt that we should pay them because of the victory in the French and Indian War, the colonists started to formulate, they were just beginning to really formulate the idea of no taxation without representation. Even before the infamous Stamp Act of 1765, the Sugar Act of 1764 taxed molasses and sugar, which just took the bottom out of the rum market, and that was a real disaster for the colonists. Then in 1765, in addition to the Stamp Act, There was the Quartering Act requiring Americans to house and feed British troops. Now, this is the kind of thing you learn about in a history book, but you don't think about the implications of that. That meant the women living in the colonies had to, first of all, come up with the food and make the meals for the British troops, but they were also in danger. I mean, the rape was not unheard of. And what was the recourse of these women? They had no power. And the men in their lives were subject to these military men. So it was a much more onerous thing than you think of when you just learn about the Quartering Acts. And then, of course, the Townshend Acts with their oppressive tax on tea, along with paint, paper, etc. So as the men of the old world passed those laws, the women in the new world started organizing against them. And of course, the weapon that they had was the boycott. As the shoppers, the women were the key participants in the movement, and so they really had to not only boycott the goods, but enforce the boycott. And it was agreed, it was a unanimous decision not to use ribbons and et cetera, agreed to by a large circle of very agreeable ladies in this town, said the Boston Newsletter in 1767. The daughters of liberty, as well as its sons, which are mentioned downstairs, but not the daughters, were called upon to sacrifice. And one of them was upset by the merchant's lack of resolve. She put a scolding poem in the newspaper in 1768. Since the men from a party on fear of a frown are kept by a sugar plum quietly down, supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of their right, if the sons so degenerate the blessing despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise, and though we've no voice but a negative here, the use of the taxables let us forbear. Then the merchants import till your stores are all full. May the buyers be few and your traffic be dull. So the daughters were on the case, and as the Boston merchants understood that they would have dull traffic, and so they agreed to forswear imports, and anybody who violated that was really taken to task, and in a big way. At one point, there was a flyer said it's the desire that the sons and daughters of liberty refuse to buy from William Jackson. So it was a revolutionary appeal directly to the women. They were summoned to political action, and they were happy to take it. And one of the most fabulous letters of Abigail Adams to John Adams was one when she wrote to him about a coffee merchant after the tea was boycotted and coffee started to be the drink of choice. A coffee merchant was hoarding his stock to jack up the price. And so she wrote to John that an eminent, wealthy, stingy merchant who is a bachelor was hoarding the coffee. And so she says, a number of females, some say 100, some say more, assembled with a cart and trucks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver, upon which one of them seized him by his neck and tossed him into the cart. He delivered the keys. When they tipped up the cart and discharged him, then they opened the warehouse, hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it into the trucks, and drove off. It was reported that he had a spanking among them, but this, I believe, was not true. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction. So the women had taken up the cause with a huge amount of enjoyment, clearly. But then when the British marched into Boston and occupied the city, March 1st, 1768, a day that Mercy Otis Warren wrote was a day that was marked with infamy. Does that sound familiar? She wrote it first. And of course she was the wife of James Warren, the sister of James Otis, the Donald Trump of his day, and a very, very, very influential propagandist for the revolution. At one point during this period, among the men of the rebellion, John Adams and Sam Adams, she was as influential as Thomas Paine, and they used her and called on her to write for newspapers and pamphlets and poems and plays to rev up activity against the British. So after the British came into Boston, other imports were boycotted, including cloth. So the women then had to replace the cloth that wasn't coming in from Great Britain. And so clergymen organized spinning bees, where groups of women would come together and they'd turn the spinning wheels by the hour. And newspapers heralded their activities. In 1769, the Boston Evening Post wrote that the industry and frugality of American ladies must exalt their character in the eyes of the world and serve to show how greatly they are contributing to bring about the political salvation of a whole continent. And in the Essex Gazette of Salem, Massachusetts, in 1769, the Daughters of Liberty were hailed for serving their country, spinning from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening. So the women were very, very much involved in, there was a boycott agreement, a ladies' boycott agreement in February of 1770, where in Boston, women from 300 families, including, quote, ladies of the highest rank and influence, according to the Boston Evening Post, publicly promised totally to abstain from the use of tea. They continued, "This agreement we cheerfully come into, as we believe the very distressed situation of our country requires it." The men were not quite so cheerful. John Adams was in Maine trying to drum up business, and he stopped at a tavern run by a female tavern keeper and asked for tea. She was horrified, and she refused to even serve him the smuggled in tax-free tea. And he said, "I must be weaned, the sooner the better." But the boycotts, of course, didn't deter the British, and things, as you well know, went from worse to worse with the Boston Massacre in 1770, and then the Boston Tea Party in late 1773. In early 1774, as the women of the city were organizing and very agitated, Mercy Otis Warren wrote to her friend Hannah Winthrop, "Be known unto Britain, even American daughters are politicians and patriots, and will aid the good work with their female efforts." And the Patriots circulated a petition called the Solemn League and Covenant, calling on all adult persons of both sexes to boycott British imports. So a very explicit call on women to leave the domestic sphere, come into the political sphere, and aid the cause. And then to formalize all of this, the First Continental Congress, of course, convened in Philadelphia in September of 1774, and they made the boycott a national priority, and then tried to determine what further steps to take. And in the practice of all Congresses since, the next step they decided to take was to meet again the next year. And they determined that they would meet in May of 1775. Well, here in Boston, you know what happened in April of 1775, of course. Lexington and Concord had happened. But again, you know, we learn about these things in our history books, or even here on the Freedom Trail and all of that. But you don't think about the impact on women and children. And Hannah Winthrop fled from her home in Cambridge. Her husband, John, that era's John Winthrop, was a professor at Harvard. And she wrote about it later. She said, "Time would never erase the horrors of that midnight cry preceding the bloody massacre at Lexington, when we were roused from the benign slumbers of the season by the beat of drum and ringing of bells, with the dire alarm that 1,000 troops of George III had gone forth to murder the peaceful inhabitants of the surrounding villages. She was directed to a place about a mile from town, but what a distressed house did we find it, filled with women whose husbands had gone forth to meet the assailants, 70 or 80 of these, with numberless infant children, weeping and agonizing for the fate of their husbands, In addition to this scene of distress, we were for some time in the site of battle. And then the refugees moved on to another town. Thus we began our pilgrimage, alternately walking and riding, the roads filled with frightened women and children, some in carts with their tattered furniture, others on foot fleeing into the woods. But what added greatly to the horrors of the scene was our passing through the bloody field of Montauk, which was strewed with mangled bodies. So it was an outraged and outlawed Continental Congress that met in May, and in June appointed George Washington to be commander of a non-existent Continental Army. That's also actually an amusing story, because one of the few extant letters we have from George Washington to Martha Washington, who burned all of her mail from him, which, you know, I could kill her for, but he says to her, I hesitate to write you this letter. You'll be so distressed, and I know it's going to upset you, but I've been named commander of the army. Now, the fact that he left Mount Vernon dressed in his militia uniform and wore that to the Congress might have had something to do with it. But the day after he was appointed, before he even got here, the British fought the Battle of Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill. And Abigail Adams, with her little boy, John Quincy Adams, witnessed it. And he wrote years later, "For the space of 12 months, my mother with her infant children dwelt liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood or taken and carried to Boston as hostages," because that's what was happening to the Patriot women. And it was extremely dangerous. Even at home, refugees were coming in, and her little tiny, if you've been to it, that little salt box of a house that she was in with 4 little children, and soldiers coming, refugees coming. It was, she wrote to John at one point, "You can't imagine how we live." But she was up for it. She had been badgering the men about the British even as they were temporizing, the men in Philadelphia. And she wrote very early on, "The only alternative which every American thinks of is liberty or death." And that was many months before Patrick Henry spoke those words. The news that the women sent from Boston was very useful in bringing the men in Philadelphia from the other colonies together to defend the people of Massachusetts. Mercy Otis Warren wrote, "The desks, the pews, and other encumbrances are taken down in the Old South Church to make it convenient for General Burgoyne's light horse." She was horrified. And then Abigail Adams wrote about the British preparing for war. She said, "The governor is making all kinds of warlike preparations, such as mounting cannon on Beacon Hill, digging entrenchments upon the neck, placing cannon there, encamping a regiment there, throwing up breastworks, etc., etc." And John responded to her, well, that the Congress is going to support the colony, that they were getting the support, and he urged his wife to have no fear. He says, "Frugality, my dear, frugality, economy, parsimony must be our refuge. I hope the ladies are every day diminishing their ornaments, and the gentlemen too. Let us eat potatoes and drink water. Let us wear canvas and undress sheepskins, rather than submit to the unrighteous and ignominious dominion that is prepared for us." That was easy for him to say. He was in Philadelphia. He was being wined and dined by everybody in Philadelphia. And he tells her not to worry about frivolous alarms. And then he realizes that, in fact, the British are coming. And he says, "In case of real danger, fly to the woods with our children." Thank you, John. It's very nice of you. I hope you're having a nice dinner in Philadelphia. She was fearful for herself and her children, but she was also fearful for her cause. Courage I know we have in abundance. Conduct I hope we shall not want. But powder, where shall we get a sufficient supply? And I think that's so incredible. There she was again, first of all, just getting through the day in the 18th century was very difficult. And then doing it with these little children and having to try to eke out a living because John wasn't getting paid, and putting up with everything she had to put up with. But what is her concern? We need enough ammunition. We don't have enough ammunition. It's just incredible. But finally, Washington arrived, and that was very comforting for everyone. Of course, the soldiers were housed in the Harvard dormitories, and all the ladies were very curious to meet the general. They went to the encampment at Harvard, and Abigail said, "I was struck with General Washington. The people have the highest opinion of Lee's," this is General Charles Lee, "Lee's abilities, but you know the continuation of the popular breath depends much on favorable events." So she got the politics of it. Mercy Otis Warren said that George Washington was amiable and accomplished, but that Charles Lee was plain in his person to a degree of ugliness, careless even to unpoliteness, his manners morose. So she didn't know we'd be reading her mail a couple hundred years later. There was one woman that George Washington actually invited to camp to come and meet with him, and that was Phyllis Wheatley. Now, you in Boston know about Phyllis Wheatley. Most of the rest of the country, I'm sad to say, does not. But she was a girl who had come to Boston as an enslaved child, and you forget that slavery was not only legal in all of the colonies, but extant in all of the colonies before the Revolution. She got here when she was probably 7 or 8 years old. We know that because she still had her baby teeth. And she was named Wheatley after the family that she went to live with. Phyllis was the name of the ship she came in on. And quickly, the teenagers, mainly the girl in the family, caught on that this little girl was very smart and started teaching her to read and write, and then the Bible, and then Latin. And then she turned out to be an extraordinary poet, and her poetry was published all over the colonies, and then she tried to get a book published and couldn't, but the important men of Boston wrote to British publishers and endorsed her and said she really did write these. And everybody was amazed. First of all, she was a teenager. Secondly, she was a slave. Thirdly, she was a woman. But her poems were published, and she became an instant celebrity on both sides of the ocean. And General Washington said to her, "If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses." So she was actually invited. When Martha Washington showed up at camp, everybody really came to visit because they wanted to see what Lady Washington looked like and what she was wearing and all of that. And her story, she's not a woman of Boston, but she was an incredible patriot who went to camp with the soldiers for the 8 long years of the Revolution. And she was terrified at first, saying, "I shudder every time I hear a cannon boom." But Washington demanded her presence because he felt that she was so absolutely essential for troop morale. And so she hung in through the war, and then when she became First Lady, became one of the great advocates for lobbying Congress for veterans benefits for the men she had been at camp with those many years. The women, though, were still at this point pressuring for independence. The men still had not declared independence. And in fact, the Congress in July of 1775 sent to England the Olive Branch petition trying to make peace, and Abigail Adams was just furious, calling these men the lukewarms. And then she went to church, and the preacher was urging reconciliation, and she was really furious. She said, "Let us separate. They are unworthy to be our brethren. Instead, we should beseech the Almighty to blast their counsels." But she was thinking about this all the time, and she knew she was thinking about a new form of government, all of this while she was raising those children and all that. And she knew that with independence would come some kind of new government, and she was curious what form it might take. So she wrote in November of 1775 to John, "If we separate from Britain, what code of laws will be established? How shall we be governed so as to retain our liberties? She was always worried about that. She always took the cause of the weak against the strong, the poor against the rich, slaves against the masters, women against men. And so it was in that spirit that she wrote her famous March 31st, 1776 letter, where she penned her most famous words. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. This is March. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She was just saying what the men were saying. But it was, of course, even more revolutionary, and he just laughed at her. He said, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. And then he did the age-old put-down of, you women really have all the secret power. He said, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. She then tried to enlist her friend Mercy Warren in her campaign. Mercy Warren's brother, James Otis, had been an early supporter of women's rights and suffrage. And she said to Mercy, I ventured to speak a word in behalf of our sex, who are rather hardly dealt with by the laws of England, which give such unlimited power to the husband to use his wife ill. And of course that was true. Women well into the late 19th century were the property of their husbands. And so the husbands used them at their will. And she then told her friend what John had responded, and Mercy never answered her. I think probably not wanting to get on the wrong side of the men. So Abigail just shot off one last volley to her husband. I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is, like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. Well, it took a couple of 100 years, but she was... Well, it was also in March of 1776 that Henry Knox had his brilliant maneuver of sneaking the cannons from Ticonderoga on to Dorchester Heights, and the British waking up and discovering they were going to be annihilated, and so they evacuated with 1,000 Loyalist families. They had occupied the city for 8 years as a foreign force, essentially, and among the Loyalist families that evacuated with them was Henry Knox's wife, Lucy Flecker Knox's family. So she was left bereft. But then the question was what to do with the Loyalist or the Tory women who didn't leave, the ones left behind. And Abigail wrote, a number of gentlemen who were together at Cambridge thought it highly proper that a committee of ladies should be chosen to examine the Tories' ladies. And the committee was herself, Mercy Otis Warren, and Hannah Winthrop. And John then wrote to her and said, as you are a politician and now elected to an important office, that of Judges of the Tory ladies, which will give you naturally an influence with your sex, I hope you will be exhorting them to use their influence with the gentlemen to fortify. So that, he thought that he could enlist them. But that's all we know. And this is one of the great frustrations in writing women's history. We have those two little tidbits, and that's it. Nobody can find any record of the Committee of the Ladies, what they did, whether they actually convened, So it's one of the things that's constantly happening when you're writing women's history, is that you get a wonderful lead that's taking you down a path, and then it's a complete dead end or blind lead. But Abigail certainly did consider herself a politician. She at one point said that she had met with a sister delegate, meaning the wife of somebody else who was at the Continental Congress, and she said, "Why should we not assume your titles when we give up our names?" Finally, independence. The word came, what she had been praying for, what she had been absolutely working for a couple of years now. Independence happened. She had come into Boston from Braintree, it was called then, now Quincy. She had come in to get the smallpox inoculation, which was a very dangerous thing to do. If you survived it, you were unlikely to get smallpox, and that was a good thing, but it was if you survived it, and a lot of people didn't. Then you had to stay in quarantine after you got it. But she got up out of her quarantine because she wanted to go hear the Declaration of Independence read from the balcony of the State House in Boston. She reported that great attention was given to every word, and then when it was done, the cry from the balcony was, "God save our American states," and then 3 cheers which rendered the air. The bells rang, the privateers fired, the cannon were discharged, and every face appeared joyful. So independence had finally been declared, but now, of course, it had to be achieved, and that took an 8-long-year war. And there were times when there was tremendous deprivation and sacrifice. Sacrifice that John assumed that Abigail would take a part with me in the struggle, and she did. And early in the war, soon after the independence was declared, it didn't look good at all. It looked like we could lose. The British occupied New York, and things were looking pretty dim. But Abigail Adams wrote, "We are in no way dispirited here. We possess a spirit that will not be conquered. If our men are all drawn off and we should be attacked, you would find a race of Amazons in America." So those are our women of Boston. They did a great job for the country in terms of spurring the men on to declare independence, and then seeing the country through the war, and then an even tougher period, the early republic. I've been delighted to share them with you, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. Thank you very much.
So I didn't know a lot of this history, being on the right side and the wrong side of the war. But so when the Congress was finally founded, did John Adams do anything for women, or just
No.
everything just went on?
No, what he did do, so I was shortening there. So Abigail did say to him after, so he wrote to her, again, we're still in the Continental Congress, and he, after Declaration of Independence, they started noodling around with the questions of, well, who would have the power, the federal government or the states, all the things that became the issues when the Constitution was debated in 1787. And they eventually just put those all off because they had a war to fight. But he said to her, "You love to pick a political bone," and asked her about what she thought about those things. And she said, "Well, if we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women." She wanted to make sure that at least there'd be women's education. And this time he said, he agreed with her. "Your sentiments on the importance of education in women are exactly agreeable to my own. In reading history, you will generally observe when you light upon a great character, whether a general, a statesman, or a philosopher, some female about him, either in the character of a mother, wife, or sister, who has the knowledge and ambition above the ordinary level of women, and that much of his eminence is owing to her precepts, example, or instigation in some shape or other." So behind every great man, there's a great woman. And he definitely wanted to be a great man, so he was pumping up the, And so what did happen as a result of the war was women's education. Not women's rights, but women's education, because everybody kind of looked around and said, well, now we've got this huge experiment in self-government, and nobody knows how to do that. And what it requires is virtuous citizens. And how do we get virtuous citizens? Oh, mothers. And so that then meant women's education, and it took off after the war. Yeah. Yes.
Did these women become public leaders of thinking, or were these all just discreet thoughts to their husbands?
Well, Mercy Otis Warren certainly did. She became, she was always out there, and then later in the early 19th century, she wrote a big 2-volume history of the American Revolution, which I commend to you. It's hard going because it's that kind of language, early 19th century language, but it's the only thing you'll read from that period that does talk about how women were affected. Now, by that time, she was disaffected from John Adams and some of her other old friends. She had remained what was called an old Republican, and they had become Federalists, and she thought they were too monarchical, and so they were political battles. But she was definitely out there. There were other women like Judith Sargent Murray, who was out there as a writer and a propagandist for women's rights. And Abigail Adams, everybody knew her political views. By the time she became First Lady, people were terrified of her. They said she's the presidentess not of the country, but of a faction, because she was so partisan in her politics. And so they didn't hide their light under a bushel, but their ability to get their voice heard was much constrained because of the times. One of the things that's interesting in my most recent book was that the Civil War actually did allow those women to get on public platforms in a way that was less true after the Revolutionary War. But it was, that time period was a dramatic time period in terms of development. Yes.
I'm thinking about the Salem witch trials. This is the only
Those are much earlier.
But this is the only way that those women became known to us. And so I'm just curious, during this period, were any of those uppity women ever prosecuted? Do we have any evidence of, like court records of any trials?
No, that didn't happen. Could you all hear the question? Yeah, so the Salem witch trials, first of all, were considerably earlier, but secondly, these women, people wanted them to be uppity. They were congratulated for it because they were considered patriots. And in fact, Abigail Adams at one point wrote that women were really better patriots than the men because they were making all of the sacrifices and enduring all of the hardships of the war, and that if we won, that the men would hold all the high offices and women wouldn't even be able to vote, so women were better patriots. And John actually agreed with her. So it was encouraged at that stage. And the revolutionary women were always looked back on by the women of later ages as a heroic breed. And of course, there were women who fought in the war, and women spies. Spying does become women's work. It's interesting. And those stories are, of course, dramatic and wonderful, of women riding through the night on a horse with their hair flying behind them, and one of them, Emily Geiger, was trying to deliver a message to General Greene, and the British did stop her, and so she swallowed the message. They were going to search her, but they had to get a female searcher, it's like TSA. And so while they were waiting for the woman to show up, she read the message, memorized it, and swallowed it. And so by the time the searcher got there, there was no message. And so she was let go, and even knowing that danger, she kept going and delivered the message. And there are lots of stories like that. So there was a very strong sense that these were extraordinary women who were quite heroic. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can you talk more about Wheatley, how she became a slave, how she came to the U.S.?
Excuse me, who?
Wheatley? Wheatley.
Well, she was captured. I mean, the way most slaves came to the U.S. She was captured by slave traders as a child, ripped from her mother's breast, as she put it in one of her most moving poems, and thrown on the slave ship, the Phyllis. But then another, I think, heroic woman of the time was Mumbet, Elizabeth Freeman, and she was in Northampton, Massachusetts, somewhere in Western, I think it was Northampton. She was in Western Massachusetts, and she worked for a family and where she overheard the men writing the Massachusetts Constitution that they were writing as a result of the Declaration of Independence, right? And so, and Theodore Sedgwick was one of the main men. And she heard them debating in the parlor the whole question of the inclusion of a phrase in the Constitution saying all men are born free and equal. And she had a particularly vicious woman she worked for who went after her, and she escaped and ran to Sedgwick's house and said, you know, I heard you debating all of this about free and equal, what about me? And he took her case and took it to court, and she won her freedom and punitive damages. And it was really the first case in Massachusetts that created abolition in Massachusetts, and then was one of the cases that was used to argue for abolition in the rest of the country. So that took tremendous courage on her part. And so she's also someone to keep very much in mind as a revolutionary woman.
Is there much evidence of women from different communities and cities communicating or corresponding with women, like-minded women, say from Boston to New York or to Philadelphia or any of the major cities where there might have been some kind of
there's correspondence between women here and sort of revolutionary women in Great Britain. So Catherine Macaulay, who was a great Republican with a small r, and defender of the colonies, wrote a big history, and there was a lot of correspondence back and forth with her. She was a bit of a crazy woman. At one point, you know, when somebody got arrested, the hope of the British was that he was, you know, either Boylan or Oil be forced to marry Catherine Macaulay. There's not correspondence among the women in the colonies. They didn't know each other. The people were far away. And keep in mind, well into the 19th century, people referred to their state as their country. When somebody would say my country, they meant Virginia or Massachusetts. And I remember at one point, Rufus King, who was a congressman from New York, Rufus King was from here, married Mary Alsop from New York, and John Adams wrote, this intermarriage is going to be very good and, for the country. So there wasn't, the kind of correspondence you'd see would be among family members. So Benjamin Franklin to his sister, Jane Meekum, here in Massachusetts, that kind of thing, but not among the women. Now, the one exception to that was in 1780, when the war was really going south. The French had not yet arrived. The American soldiers were unpaid, unhoused, unclothed, and threatening desertion by regiment. Esther de Burt Reed, who was an Englishwoman who had then married an American and become an ardent patriot, was the wife at that point of the governor called the President of Pennsylvania. And she organized a fundraising drive among the women of Philadelphia where in this, and they went door to door. They kept wonderful records. We have their records, thank God. And they raised in the course of just a few weeks about $300,000 in 1780, which, to put it in context, Robert Morris, trying to capitalize a bank, a national bank, was able to raise $360,000. So, this was quite a bit of money, and it made a huge difference in terms of troop morale. But she did write to the other first ladies of the states and asked them to have a fundraising drive. And we do have those letters. In fact, the only extant letter of Martha Jefferson's that we have is because Thomas Jefferson burned all of her mail because he was heartbroken. That's his story. But so the only extant letter of Martha Jefferson's that we have is her calling on the women of Virginia when she was First Lady of Virginia to give for the troops. And we have those from the other First Ladies as well. So that communication took place. Yes. Yeah.
What did you find in, for example, Abigail Adams' background that sort of created this woman that was so, it seems like forward-thinking and certainly very much your own person?
So Abigail Adams was raised by her father in Weymouth, her father and mother in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and she and her two sisters, both of whom, Elizabeth Shaw and Mary Cranch, both of whom were very strong-minded women and very articulate and interesting. Their letters among the three are fascinating. And the father taught, educated them. He was a minister, and he and his students, his ministerial students, educated the girls. And so they had much more, wherewithal of an education than a lot of American women. And her parents must have just let her talk. because the sisters did too. So that was clearly the atmosphere in the household. And Mercy Otis Warren was very much encouraged by every man in her life to speak up and go forward. I mean, the things they wrote to her were quite, stirring about, you're brilliant, you do it, you go for it, all of that. But it's interesting because she's kind of the exception that proves the rule in terms of the way that these women made it possible for the men to do what they did. I mean, John Adams couldn't have gone off and thought great thoughts in Philadelphia if Abigail Adams had not been home keeping everything together, right? And Mercy Warren couldn't do that. And she couldn't manage on her own. And she had 5 sons, but so she basically wouldn't let James Warren be a founding father. And every time he was offered some position, he rejected most of them. And the letters back and forth among the others all say, the lady wouldn't let him take it. But then she has the nerve to say to Abigail Adams, you have to let him go to England, I mean, thanks. You won't let him go to, from where were they, Plymouth to Boston, but England, fine. Everybody else. But before we go downstairs and have a nice reception, I would like to just say one thing about this beautiful place. We are living in a moment in American culture and history where libraries have never been more important. And it's a funny thing because people tend to think, oh, libraries, they're full of books. What are those? And the truth is, libraries have become social service agencies, community centers, as well as great places of learning and of sources of wonderful information. People coming to this country or people coming to the city find that they need to use the libraries to have access to a computer, to ask a librarian how to write a resume, ask a librarian what kinds of places they could possibly get employment, learn all kinds of things. And the libraries are being called upon more and more and more by state and local governments to do all kinds of things for the community, whether it's house an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or to just make it possible to stay open later so that people can get in out of the cold. And that comes at a time of fewer and fewer resources. And so it's wonderful that the Lowell Foundation is willing to give a free event like this, but it is also really, really important to support the library, because our libraries need us more than ever, and we need them more than ever. So thank you very much.
The garden was a testament to true and unconditional brotherhood from the earth on up to the sky, a daily lesson in acceptance and equality. Each living creature had a story, a purpose, a reason for being, and a beauty of its own. Through the majestic trees in the garden, Malcolm would also learn about the importance of roots, nature's anchors, the base of every living creature, and through the outspread wings of the chirping birds above, he began to see the power of possibility. And so these are the kinds of values that were really instilled in young Malcolm so that he could later on in his adult life reach back onto the foundation that his parents had provided once his mother was taken away and institutionalized and his father was assassinated